Chapter 1. Completed. The great temple of Thanae and Agnoruk was built. At the end of the Age of the Damned, it was a work carried out little by little, from humble beginnings, to end up being the largest temple in all of E-Youth. Times. Agnoruk's life in E-Youth. Author, Priestess Balana. His fingers were raw. The last effort had exhausted what little strength he had left. He turned his head and contemplated the landscape, in the background Vale Nevodo, on the horizon the peaks of the Mist Mountains, guarding the whole place in an imposing way but always paying homage to the great Emperor of the North. A huge granite peak that protruded almost unnaturally over all its rock brethren. Agnoruk watched again as the great mountain watched his steps closely, judging him with a certain severity, even though the half-orc was not climbing its slopes. He would never commit such recklessness. Since he was a child he had been warned that the great emperor would not allow them to climb his stony body. The half-orc was climbing the nearest and most benevolent peak. The people of Snowy Valley called him the White Lady. An ascent with steeper ramps despite its considerable height and a much more stable climate for a climb. But it was not a walk either. The gravel and stones that abounded in his bed were obstacles that made the ascent very complicated. It was already the fourth time in the ascent that he had skated down the slope and only his strong hands prevented him from falling off the cliff. He sighed for a moment. Perhaps he hadn't prepared his plan quite well. A pickaxe would have been of great help to him at this moment, instead of entrusting everything to his brute force. To add insult to injury, the ropes were leaving marks on his back, as well as the heavy rock he was carrying. Surely what I was doing was a real stupidity, but there was no turning back. I didn't plan to leave it now after 2 days of non-stop climbing. He focused on the goal, a plain located 200 meters from the summit that they called the viewpoint of the lady. He decisively advanced with a firm and constant step despite the pain. He left his mind blank and concentrated on making sure that each step was safe. Even so, the last meters were torture for his whole body, but he endured with fortitude, managing to reach his destination. Exhausted, the half-orc finally dropped the huge stone. He let out a groan of relief. Seeing the blood on the rock, he didn't need to check that his back was battered and his shirt was totally worn out by the friction with the ropes that held the rock. Agnoruk did not complain and continued with his plan. He took a deep breath and with all his strength lifted the rock to leave it on a natural pedestal that the half-orc a few weeks ago had chiseled so that the rock would have a more stable position. With this show of strength, he placed the rock over his final settlement to fall to the ground exhausted. He began to gasp in pain as he rested his battered back on the pedestal. When he raised his head, there was the stone placed right in front of the great emperor, who seemed to smile pleased. The stone had a cubic shape. The surface was not polished, but on the face of the cube opposite the great mountain he had carved a simple symbol, a circle with 3 smaller circles inside forming an equilateral triangle. The symbol was the same as his tattoo, indicating that he belonged to the tribe of White Orcs, even though he had never grown up with them. The madness of climbing a stone of such size to the viewpoint occurred to him the first time he ascended to the area. When he saw that there was a kind of protrusion in the form of a pedestal, he had the feeling that perhaps it meant that something wanted a kind of altar to be placed on top of it. As he really had little to do during the winter, he dedicated himself to chiseling and molding the piece of stone to make more or less a shape of a cube and chiseling the symbol of the Senurfti, White Orcs. After a good rest, he took a seat right in front of the stone cube that was placed in front of the great emperor. Agnoruk placed on top of the block of stone 3 pairs of tusks that when they came into contact with the first rays of the sun dissolved into ashes, which were carried away by the wind in the direction of the great emperor. The half-orc closed his eyes. 2 years had passed since he decided to return to his father's abandoned house. He lived in a solitary way. He had very few interactions with the inhabitants of Vale Nevodo, except when he went down to get provisions in exchange for some furs and savings. Then he would greet old acquaintances, spend the afternoon in the tavern to listen to the news that was being told there. But the novelty is that on the outskirts of the town there was a new temple dedicated to the goddess Thanae, much larger than the previous one, which was only a simple shack. From what he was told about a decade before his return, a new priestess had arrived in Vale Nevodo, who dedicated herself body and soul to the task of expanding the temple. Now a small community of devotees lived inside. Something very strange for a place like Snowy Valley. The Thanae priesthood is solitary and priestly communities were often concentrated in the great capitals of Shanaris. Agnoruk's return was not lost on the chief priestess, and she knew who the half-orc was. The woman sometimes went up to see him to ask him to comply with certain commands ordered by the goddess. Agnoruk did not usually talk to her, he only accepted the tasks with a simple affirmation. To the half-orc it was evident that the priestess was in Snowvale for him. The last mission entrusted by the goddess was a fortnight ago. A trio of vampires were getting very close to Snowy Valley and had to be finished off. Thanae hates vampires like any being that unnaturally prolongs death. The request was clear, to eliminate them. Agnoruk, who also hated vampires in a visceral way, accepted the request and set off. As he had grown older and as a result of the experience, Agnoruk knew that he had a special talent when it came to tracking the undead, probably due to his divine ancestry, so it was not difficult for him to find them. In addition, their prey were too young and inexperienced and too bloodthirsty. They had destroyed an isolated farm, causing a massacre near the forest of Temarin, which was what set off the alarms to the priests. So it was easy for him to find the cave where they were hiding in the daylight. The half-orc, however, waited until nightfall, and when the trio went out to look for new victims, he finished with them without mercy, but he tore out their fangs. They were very young. Deep down he felt sorry for them. Although their presence indicated that vampires resurfaced in an uncontrolled way, they usually used to move in a much more sibylline way, without attracting attention. When wandering groups appeared, it meant that their number was growing. It was none of his business. He dedicated himself to fulfilling the ritual. He beheaded them and burned their bodies to deliver the ashes to the priestess who would place them on the altar of Thanae. The half-orc kept the fangs of the vampires for himself, hiding them from the sunlight, until today, when he placed the 3 pairs of teeth on the stone. The fangs disintegrated when they came into contact with sunlight. Why had he kept the fangs? As a reminder that I had to fulfill a promise I had made a long time ago, perhaps too long. Agnoruk closed his eyes as the scent of vampire ashes transported him to this place. Like the first time, he could feel the flames again and the vampire king smiling as he confidently approached him, savoring a victory with his blood. What happened next was a bit blurry. I never remembered how it really happened. In his memory, the image of the decapitated head of the king in his hands crowded into his memory, in the background 2 figures that they watched in amazement at what had just happened. They were unreachable for Agnoruk since they were protected by a wall of flame. In his head resounded a promise made by a young half-orc swearing that he would end the curse they now carried, even if it took him a lifetime to achieve it. Then darkness. That was the most important mistake of his entire life. He had failed them and now they were blood-eaters. But he wasn't here for them, he was here for his father. He had never honored it as he deserved, and climbing this rock to the lady's viewpoint seemed to him the most appropriate thing to do now that he had time. He stayed for a long time, but he had to start the descent if he didn't want the night to catch him going down the most complicated part. The half-orc rose. With his hand he touched the surface of the stone, no trace of the fangs, the breeze had scattered the ashes. He closed his eyes and said goodbye to the place. Paulana. Excuse me, but we must go back to 5 years before Agnoruk's ascension to the White Lady. Most of the inhabitants of Shanaris believe that the elves have no problems. They live cloistered in their kingdoms protected by their magnificent defenses. Although the fall of Tortanel made that halo of legendary invulnerability they had during the Age of the Damned disappear when they were defeated by the Black Empire. At the end of the Age of the Damned, only 3 of the ancient great elven kingdoms were left standing, Bordalania, Berseria and Landaria. the Dark Elves had long since been left without their kingdom invaded by the Stufos. As happened to the dwarfs of the Brown Hills, they could not resist. They were exiled from their deep realms and now roamed the south of Darsuk. When the Queen of Lordania asked for help for an invasion of Stufos, the King of Bordalania was more willing to help than when the Dark Elves begged him for help. The grudges that the king held against them for the ancient war between the elves were very evident, and he flatly refused. Fortunately for Landaria, they were always regarded as loyal allies. The great king was more receptive and in response to the request sent a brigade of his best soldiers, the Knights of Elen, under the command of his son Prince Erinch. In addition, the problem that Landaria suffered was known to him, although he would never admit it publicly. The expedition made up of 2,000 knights embarked for Landaria. When they arrived at their destination, the situation they found was dantesque. The minds of the elves of Landaria were totally invaded by the Stufos, who, as was their tactic, advanced in an endless horde. No matter how many died, more always appeared from the depths to replace the fallen and continue advancing. Not only were they helped by the kingdom of Bordalania, the other Bursary elf kingdom, they came ready to help. They sent their best warrior Islanat, the Golden Lady, at the command of a great army, about 10,000 soldiers who landed from their wonderful ships. The elves of Bursary were very different from those of Bordalania, having previously aided the northern Freelands or the Dark Elves. And that help, although punctual, was much more than what Bordalania had been involved in the affairs of Shanaris, at least directly in the last era. Since the Bursarians appeared, the war changed course. Thanks to the command of the Golden Lady, the Stufos subsided in their invasion. But it was a short-lived victory. The Stufos would attack again and again in numerous hordes until they achieved total domination of the mines. Fortunately, they found a way to create a permanent barrier to stop them. In a specific area of the mines there was a large abyss that was crossed through two majestic bridges. They were the only thing that allowed communication with the lower galleries on the other side of the abyss. By demolishing the bridges, the invasion would be stopped. Since one thing was known about the Stufos, they never created galleries or built anything, they only occupied buildings that had already been completed. The abyss chamber was not a small place. It was called the Gallery of the Two Twin Bridges. And once they recovered from the Stufo domain, preparations began for the collapse of the two bridges. Paulana was enthusiastic. She was fighting alongside the Golden Lady, whom she had great admiration, a true commander whose troops followed her with devotion. What no one understood is the reason why Bursary did not help Tortanel in his fall. Perhaps as Bordalania with the Dark Elves did not help them because they had grudges stored from the old war. Paulana was a knight of the Order of Elen. She had reached the rank of captain on her own merits, since they never made it easy for her. Born in the middle of the Age of the Damned, she grew up in a sad family, her mother depressed by the contempt of her father, who was always absent from home. She was not loved since she was not the desired male child. Everything changed with the birth of his brother a few decades later. It was the pride of his parents, their joy, the only thing that really united the family. In her brother's education they never spared any expenses. Paulana was collecting the crumbs. She received the same education, but always as an accessory, since the classes were mainly for her brother. His achievements were never recognized. If he surpassed his brother, it was something his parents ignored. Still, she was the firstborn of the family and could not be denied the right to be Ellen's knight. Despite the paternal reluctance, Paulana insisted so much that the two brothers were admitted through the mediation of their father. It was there that she discovered the reason for her contempt on the part of her parents. There was a relationship between an elf and a man 10 generations before her birth, which meant that Paulana was not considered pure blood. But the worst thing is that there was a belief that human inheritance was only received by the elves of the family, hence the indignity of their lineage. His father had married his mother only because of the fact that the maternal family was reputed to possess an innate ability to father boys. Misfortune came during the War of Tortanel, where his brother died. That death caused the downfall of his family, causing his mother's suicide. Since with Paulana as the only heir, her lineage was stained. His father would die a little later, in the Battle of the Gorge of the Theres, where the Black Orc legions were massacred in revenge for the fall of Tortanel. She was one of the few knights who did not participate in that battle. She was assigned to defend the northern borders. Her father did not consider her worthy to take revenge for the death of her brother. Paulana faced with resignation the news of her father's death, but not her mother's suicide, since the reason was to have Paulana as her only heir. It was a total contempt for the elf. Despite the hatred that the news of the suicide generated in her, it didn't really surprise Paulana. In fact, it was approved and admired by many elves. Paulana got ahead despite having everything against her. With her parents, she had long since distanced herself, and her brother always considered her as a burden in his career. Having a mixed-race sister would not allow her to rise in the court as much as she aspired. And the elf, once free of those chains, ended up achieving some recognition within the Order of Ellen, rising to the rank of captain, but deep down she knew that this was her ceiling. They would not let her rise anymore. The high ranks were reserved for pure bloods. She was the last of her lineage and no one cared. They did not consider her as one of their own at court. No one would risk marrying her since her children would inherit human blood, a crucial stigma. She was not well regarded in the royal palace. Paulana was always destined to the borders, so it was not a surprise that she was assigned to the aid expedition to Landaria. The mission was not to the taste of the great knights of the Order, and they sent the less appreciated. Despite these opinions, at court the great king had ordered his son Prince Enrich to command the expedition. He wasn't someone Paulana had a special affinity with, but she had to accept it. He had to be very careful not to take the limelight away from the prince. It was well known that he eliminated all those who he considered could overshadow him. Enrich had taken this mission as an insult, having to fight Stufos underground to save other elves, whom the prince thought were inferior. The prince considered it as a contempt for his qualities and caused his already complicated character to be much more unpredictable and irascible than usual during the campaign. In addition, it did not help that he was always in the shadow of the Golden Lady. The prince had to accept her command and his total prominence during the campaign. For that reason the prince used to show a certain indolence to be present in the combat, but this time he could not escape, since it was the final battle. The Golden Lady's plan was to blow up the two bridges thanks to an ingenuity she had obtained from gnomes. The cousins of the dwarfs were usually talented at creating these explosive devices and were safer than relying on the intonations of a mage. The battle was unfolding as planned. The Stufos and the vermin that accompanied them had to retreat in the face of the great elf offensive. The reptiloids hid inside the eastern galleries. It was the right time to place the explosive devices. The Golden Lady ordered a group of volunteers to defend the other side of the bridge until the device was ready for the explosion. Ellen's knights were tasked with guarding the westernmost bridge and were placed on the safe side. A group of dark elves volunteered to cross the bridge and defend it from the attacks of the Stufos while they planted the explosive device. The dark elves were indebted to Laudania as it was the only elf kingdom that helped them when they lost their kingdom. The eastern bridge was blown up as volunteers defending the other end of the fountain reached the safe side of the chasm. But the plans do not always go perfectly. The second artifact had problems when it came to activating the detonation mechanism and coincided with a brutal counterattack by the Stufos, who must have suspected the intentions of their rivals. The reptilians intended to cross the bridge before it collapsed. The dark elves barely resisted the brutal attack. What was clear was that they would be sacrificed since they could not leave their positions before the artifact exploded. If the bridge was not demolished, so much effort would be in vain. They start to retreat. Paulana exclaimed. It's none of our business. Our orders are to stay on this side of the bridge and hold the position, replied the prince indolently. It wasn't long before the gnomes fixed the detonation system, knocking down the bridge. The dark elves would die and be devoured by the Stufos. So the elf stood helpless as her allies were outnumbered and slaughtered. It was an injustice and she could not take it anymore. She ordered her troops to go on the attack, skipping the prince's orders. Only the soldiers of her battalion advanced, who knew her and were absolutely faithful to her. They ignored the prince. The prince's face was one of surprise and hatred when he saw how he was disobeyed. Without hesitation he ordered the rest of the knights to hold the position, under penalty of treason if anyone dared to accompany Paulana in her suicidal adventure. Paulana's help eased the situation for a moment and recomposed the defensive line, but it was too delicate a situation. They had to retreat to cross the bridge, but without the help of Prince Enrich they would not make it. However, the prince refused to help them, preferring them dead as punishment for their insubordination. It was then that help appeared. The Golden Lady emerged like a lightning bolt that ended a mountain of Stufos. Her appearance had restored their confidence. The green blood of the Stufos began to bathe the bridge and they achieved something that seemed impossible. The Stufos retreated to the lower galleries, but they did not have much time. Soon they would reorganize themselves again and attack again. All the survivors crossed the bridge, with Paulana and the Golden Lady being the last to cross as the structure exploded into 1,000 pieces. Now the Stufos could not cross this chasm and ceased to be a threat to Landaria, at least for a long time. The war ended with this triumphant battle. The kingdom of Landaria and the Dark Elves thanked Paulana for her help, who was also decorated for her noble action by the Golden Lady herself. Not everything was joy. Despite her feat, she was not congratulated by her superior, quite the opposite. The prince after the ceremony met Paulana in a secluded place. "It's the last time you leave me in evidence. I am your superior. Your prince." Enrich was totally irritated, not only for the disobedience but for having taken away the prominence of the military campaign. "I warn you, if you disobey a direct order again, you will fight the Stufos for the rest of your life." Enrich took the medal from her and threw it into the sea to lose sight of her. "You don't deserve it." Paulana was left alone watching the medal sink. The prince disappeared, but they were not alone. The Golden Lady had been secretly watching the scene. "He will never be a great warrior, he is too proud." Paulana did not answer, she was silent. "I'm sorry. You have fought well, have no doubts about yourself, you have acted in the right way. But I don't understand." Paulana complained bitterly. The Golden Lady watched the 2 moons, which reflected off Paulana's golden hair, giving a slight bluish sheen to her hair. "Elves have long since lost their way, we seek to maintain power in any way. Prince Enrich is the symptom of this evil." Paulana was very surprised with the Golden Lady's phrase since the tone with which she spoke was one of bitterness and sadness. "Don't worry, Paulana, if you don't find warriors worthy of you among the elves, you'll find them outside of them." The Golden Lady disappeared. Paulana did not see her again during her short stay in the now peaceful Landaria. When they returned to Borderlania, Enrich quickly demoted her from his command, forbidding herself to talk about her exploit in the Gallery of the Twin Bridges. It was a subject forbidden to the other knights. Paulana had a life of vigilance left on the borders of the kingdom, and that was something that the elf hated, but she could not give up, since a Knight of Elen was one for life.